The mission that never ended. December 1944, the Philippines. American forces are closing in, island by island, pushing back the Japanese occupation. Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda arrives on Lubang Island, a small, jungle-covered landmass about 75 miles southwest of Manila. His orders from Major Yoshimi Taniguchi are crystal clear. Conduct guerrilla warfare. Destroy the pier and the airfield to prevent enemy use. Never surrender. It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens, we'll come back for you. Onoda took those words as a sacred oath. When American and Filipino forces liberated Lubang in February 1945, most Japanese soldiers either died fighting or surrendered. But Onoda and 3 other soldiers, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, Private First Class Kinshichi Kozuka, and Private Yuichi Akatsu, melted into the jungle. They built hidden camps. They cached supplies. They watched and waited for the Americans to leave so they could resume their mission. And then came the leaflets. The propaganda they couldn't believe. In August 1945, the atomic bombs fell. Japan surrendered unconditionally. The most devastating war in human history came to an end. Millions began the long journey home. But in the jungles of Lubang, 4 men read the leaflets dropped from American planes announcing Japan's surrender, and they laughed. Of course, the Americans would claim victory. Of course, they would forge surrender documents. This was exactly what they'd been trained to expect. The crude forgeries, as they saw them, only confirmed their suspicions. The war was clearly going badly for the Americans if they had to resort to such obvious psychological warfare. In October 1945, Onoda's own commanding officer's order to surrender was dropped on the island, in leaflet form. They dismissed it as another forgery. The paper quality was wrong. Some of the military terminology wasn't quite right. Obviously, American intelligence was good, but not good enough. Then came newspapers showing photos of post-war Japan, surely manipulated. Letters from family members begging them to come home. Obvious forgeries. The Americans must have captured personnel records. Even the voice of Emperor Hirohito himself, broadcasting the imperial rescript on the termination of the war, was explained away. A recording, perhaps? An impersonator? The Americans were clever, but Onoda had been trained to see through their tricks. This is where the story becomes truly fascinating and deeply tragic. These weren't stupid men. They were intelligent, trained observers. But they were operating within a framework where every piece of contradictory evidence only reinforced their core belief. It's a psychological trap we might recognize in our own era. When your worldview has an explanation for why every challenge to that worldview is actually proof of its truth, you become invulnerable to reality itself. Survival and tragedy in the jungle. The 4 men settled into a routine that would last for years, though routine hardly captures the grinding difficulty of their existence. Each day was a calculated risk, a careful balance between survival and remaining hidden from what they believed was an enemy occupation force. They constructed a series of camps, hidden deep in the jungle, always temporary, always ready to abandon at a moment's notice. They learned which plants were edible and which were poisonous. They collected rainwater in leaves and bamboo sections. They fashioned clothes from whatever materials they could find, patching their uniforms again and again until the original fabric was barely visible, recognizable, under layers of repairs made from stolen cloth, plant fibers, and animal hides. Their diet was meager and monotonous. Stolen rice when they could get it. always taken in small amounts from different farms to avoid establishing a pattern. Bananas and coconuts from the jungle. The occasional cow they would slaughter for meat, though this was risky because it inevitably brought search parties. They learned to preserve meat by smoking it over carefully controlled fires that produced minimal smoke. They rationed everything obsessively. A bag of rice that a family might consume in a week would last them a month. But they weren't just surviving. In their minds, they were still fighting a war. They maintained military discipline. Onoda, as the highest-ranking officer, made all strategic decisions. They kept watches through the night. They maintained their weapons meticulously. Onoda's rifle was cleaned and oiled so regularly that after nearly 30 years, it remained in perfect working order. They conducted reconnaissance missions, observing troop movements, actually just Filipino civilians going about their daily lives, noting changes in infrastructure, the construction of roads and buildings, and preparing reports that no one would ever read. From their perspective, they were remarkably successful at remaining hidden and continuing their guerrilla operations. But from the perspective of the people of Lubang, they were something else entirely. They were ghosts, monsters, dangerous criminals who appeared without warning to steal food and occasionally to kill. The first confirmed death came in 1949 when a farmer stumbled upon one of their camps. In the firefight that followed, the farmer was killed. To Onoda and his men, this was a justified military action. They had been discovered by enemy forces and had defended themselves. To the farmer's family, it was murder. More incidents followed. A fisherman shot at because they thought he was part of a search party. A police officer killed in an ambush. A farmer executed because they believed he was an intelligence operative. Each death weighed on the conscience of some of the men, particularly Akatsu, who was beginning to doubt their mission. But Onoda remained firm. These were casualties of war, regrettable but necessary. The psychological toll was immense. Imagine the constant vigilance, the never-ending suspicion that every sound might be an enemy patrol, that every person you see might be there to kill you. Imagine never having a full night's sleep, never being truly safe, never being able to relax. Imagine doing this not for weeks or months, but for years. In 1950, after 6 years in the jungle, Private Akatsu could not take it anymore. The doubt had been growing in him for years. The leaflets seemed too detailed to be forgeries. The newspapers seemed too authentic. His family's messages seemed too personal. And most damning of all, if Japan was winning the war, why hadn't reinforcements come? Why were they still alone on this island? One night, Akatsu simply left. He didn't announce his intention or argue with Onoda. He knew that would be futile. He just slipped away into the darkness, and after days of wandering, surrendered to Filipino forces. The other three were stunned. How could Akatsu have been so weak? How could he have betrayed his comrades, his emperor, his duty? They never considered that perhaps Akatsu hadn't been weak at all, that it took tremendous courage to admit that the war you've been fighting might be over, that the deaths you've caused might have been for nothing. The Philippine and Japanese governments intensified their efforts to bring the remaining soldiers home. They dropped more leaflets, these ones even more sophisticated. They included family photographs, not just generic images, but actual photos from Onoda's family albums. They included personal messages with details that only family members would know. Onoda's brother, Tadao, traveled to Lubang and spent days in the jungle calling out to Hiroo with a megaphone, using their childhood nicknames, sharing memories that only they would recognize. But to Onoda, This only proved how far the enemy would go. Obviously, they had captured his family or his personnel records. Obviously, they had sophisticated intelligence operations. The fact that the messages were so personal, so accurate, so emotionally manipulative, that was precisely what the Nakano school had warned him about. The better the forgery, the more dangerous it was. Then, in 1954, tragedy struck. Corporal Shimada, who had been Onoda's closest companion and most trusted ally, was killed in a firefight with a search party. They had been spotted near a coastal village and had been exchanging shots with what they believed was an enemy patrol. Shimada took a bullet to the chest and died within minutes. Onoda and Kazuka buried their comrade in a hidden grave, marking it only with stones that they could recognize. They said prayers according to Shinto tradition, honoring Shimada's sacrifice. And then, because they were soldiers and their mission continued, they moved on. But something had changed. There were only two of them now. The isolation became more profound, the mission more difficult. They had to take greater risks to gather food and intelligence. They had to cover more ground with fewer men. The margin for error had shrunk dramatically. Still, they persisted. 20 years passed. 20 years of hiding, stealing, watching, waiting. The world transformed around them in ways they couldn't begin to imagine. Japan rose from the ashes to become an economic powerhouse, one of the world's leading economies. The United States and Soviet Union engaged in a space race that culminated in men walking on the moon, an achievement that would have seemed like pure fantasy in 1944. Wars began and ended. The civil rights movement, the sexual revolution, rock and roll and hippies and computers. And in the jungles of Lubang, 2 Japanese soldiers continued their secret mission, maintaining their weapons, following their orders, fighting their war. They had become living anachronisms, men who embodied a world that no longer existed, soldiers in an army that had been disbanded, warriors fighting for an empire that had renounced warfare itself. The end of a partnership. October 19th, 1972. After 27 years of war, Private First Class Kinshichi Kazuka died in a firefight with Philippine police. He was shot while burning rice fields, what he believed was a legitimate military operation to deny resources to the enemy. What the police saw was arson and agricultural terrorism by a dangerous fugitive. The end came quickly. Kazuka and Onoda had been conducting what they called a mission, burning rice paddies to disrupt what they believed was the enemy's food supply. They had done this before many times, as part of their guerrilla warfare tactics. But this time, the police response was swift and overwhelming. In the confusion and gunfire, Kazuka was hit. Onoda tried to reach him, to drag him to safety, but the fire was too intense. He watched his last companion fall, and then he did what his training demanded. He retreated into the jungle to fight another day. For the first time in his adult life, Hiroo Onoda was truly, completely alone. Try to imagine that loneliness. For nearly 3 decades, he had been defined by his mission and his comrades. First there had been 4, then 3, then 2, and now there was only 1. At 50 years old, Onoda was the last man standing in a war that existed only in his mind. He had no one to talk to, no one to share the burden with, no one to confirm that their interpretation of reality was correct. The solitude was crushing. Human beings are not meant to be alone, especially not under such circumstances. Every decision was now his alone. Every risk assessment, every tactical choice, every moment of doubt or fear, All of it fell solely on his shoulders. He had been a leader before, yes, but always with others to implement his plans, to provide feedback, to share the mission. Now there was nothing but silence and the sounds of the jungle. But still, he continued. His orders hadn't changed. Major Taniguchi had not relieved him of duty. The mission, as he understood it, was not complete. And so, at an age when most men are settling into middle age, thinking about retirement, watching their children grow up, Onoda continued his solitary war. He developed new routines to cope with the isolation. He talked to himself, conducting full conversations to maintain his sanity. He kept meticulous records of his observations, writing reports that no one would ever read, but that gave structure to his days. He maintained his equipment with even greater care. His rifle became like a companion, something familiar and reliable in a world that had taken everything else from him. The death of Kazuka made international headlines, which only intensified the efforts to find Onoda. The world was fascinated and horrified. There was still a Japanese soldier fighting World War II in 1972, the year of the Munich Olympics, of Watergate, of the last Apollo mission to the moon. It seemed impossible, absurd, like something from a novel rather than reality. The Japanese government launched the most extensive campaign yet to find Onoda and convince him to come home. Search parties combed the island with renewed urgency. Loudspeakers broadcast messages from his family, his aging mother pleading with him to return, his siblings sharing news of marriages and births, trying to remind him that he had a life waiting for him beyond the jungle. They flew helicopters over the island, dropping leaflets that included newspaper clippings, photographs, personal letters, anything that might break through his certainty that the war continued. Nothing worked. If anything, the intensity of the search confirmed Onoda's belief that he was important, that his continued resistance mattered, that the enemy was desperate to neutralize him. A rational person might have wondered, if the war is really over, why would they invest so many resources in finding one man? But to Onoda, the answer was obvious. They were investing these resources precisely because the war wasn't over, because his guerrilla operations were effective, because he was a threat that needed to be eliminated. He became more careful, more paranoid, more skilled at evasion. He moved his camps more frequently. He avoided any patterns in his movements. He took greater risks in gathering supplies but spent less time in any one location. He was playing a game of cat and mouse with an opponent that, in his mind, would stop at nothing to capture or kill him. To the outside world, Hiroo Onoda became something between a legend and a ghost story. The last soldier, they called him. The man who wouldn't surrender. Local children were warned about him. Don't go into the deep jungle. Don't wander alone. The Japanese soldier might get you. He was a cautionary tale, a historical curiosity, a symbol of stubborn dedication taken to its most extreme conclusion. But to himself, he was simply Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, intelligence officer, still on duty, still following orders, still waiting for the day when his commanding officer would return and tell him that the mission was complete. He had lost everyone, his comrades, his youth, nearly 3 decades of his life, but he still had his duty, and for Onoda, that was enough. The hippie who found a war. Norio Suzuki was 24 years old in 1974, and he was on a quest that perfectly captured the adventurous, anti-establishment spirit of the early 1970s. When asked what he wanted to do with his life, Suzuki had a list. He wanted to find Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman in that order. Most people thought he was crazy, another young dreamer who had read too many adventure stories and smoked too much marijuana. But Suzuki was serious, or at least serious in the way that young people can be when they've decided that conventional life isn't for them, that there must be something more interesting out there than an office job and a mortgage. He had already found his panda. He'd traveled to China and seen the giant pandas in their natural habitat, an impressive achievement in itself given the political barriers of the time. Now, in February 1974, he was pursuing the second item on his list, Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, the last soldier. Suzuki figured that all the official search parties with their helicopters, megaphones, and uniformed personnel had failed precisely because they were too official, too military, too threatening. What if, instead of conducting a manhunt, someone just went for a walk in the jungle? What if, instead of trying to capture Onoda, someone just tried to have a conversation? It was naive. It was ridiculous. And somehow, incredibly, it worked. Suzuki arrived on Lubang with nothing but a backpack, a camera, and the kind of cheerful optimism that makes parents worry and philosophers shake their heads. He had no military training, no survival skills beyond basic camping knowledge, no plan beyond walk around in the jungle and see what happens. He told the local authorities that he was a tourist interested in the island's natural beauty. They thought he was insane, but didn't stop him. After all, it was his funeral if Onoda found him. For days, Suzuki wandered through the jungle, camping in different spots, deliberately making himself visible. He lit fires at night. He sang songs. He wasn't hiding or hunting. He was simply present, a non-threatening human being in Onoda's territory. And Onoda, who had spent nearly 30 years observing, analyzing, and surviving, noticed him almost immediately. This strange young man was unlike any search party Onoda had ever seen. He wasn't armed. He wasn't wearing a uniform. He wasn't conducting a grid search or calling out commands. He was just there, camping, taking photographs, being remarkably casual about wandering through an area where a dangerous soldier was supposedly hiding. Onoda watched Suzuki for several days, trying to determine what kind of trap this was, what the trick might be. But gradually, he began to realize that there was no trap. This wasn't a military operation. This was just a young man, probably a bit foolish, wandering around in the jungle. On February 20th, 1974, Onoda made a decision that changed everything. He stepped out of the shadows. Suzuki was sitting by his campfire, probably wondering if this whole enterprise had been a terrible idea, when he saw a figure emerge from the jungle. It was a man in a tattered military uniform, holding a rifle, watching him with the careful attention of someone who had survived by never making assumptions. For a moment, neither moved. Then Suzuki did something extraordinary. He smiled and said hello, not in a formal way, not with fear or aggression, just a simple human greeting. "Good evening. Are you Lieutenant Onoda?" And just like that, after 29 years of isolation, combat, and suspicion, Hiroo Onoda was having a conversation with someone who wasn't trying to capture him or kill him. Two human beings sitting in the jungle talking. Suzuki showed Onoda his photographs of Japan, not propaganda leaflets or official documents, but personal snapshots from his travels. Here was Tokyo, rebuilt and thriving. Here were people in modern clothes, driving modern cars, living modern lives. Here was the Japan of 1974, a place so different from 1944 that it might as well have been another planet. They talked about life, about Japan, about the world. Suzuki told Onoda about the moon landing. Men had walked on the moon. He talked about computers, about television broadcasts transmitted via satellite, about jet aircraft that could cross the Pacific in hours. He told Onoda about the economic miracle that had transformed Japan from a defeated nation into one of the world's leading economies. And Onoda listened, really listened. For the first time in decades, he heard information without the filter of suspicion, without immediately analyzing it as potential propaganda. This young man wasn't trying to convince him of anything. He was just sharing his world. Suzuki asked Onoda to come home. "The war is over," he said simply. "It's been over for a long time. Your family misses you. Japan has changed. You can come home." For a moment, just a moment, Onoda wavered. There was something compelling about Suzuki's simplicity, his lack of agenda, his genuine human concern. This wasn't psychological warfare or sophisticated propaganda. This was just one person talking to another. But then the years of training, the 3 decades of commitment, the weight of all those deaths and all those sacrifices reasserted themselves. If Onoda accepted that the war was over, what did that mean? It would mean that he had wasted 29 years of his life. It would mean that every person he had killed had died for nothing. It would mean that Shimada and Kozuka had sacrificed themselves for a mission that no longer existed. It would mean that his entire adult life had been based on a misunderstanding. That was a truth too terrible to accept. Onoda refused to come home. But here's the remarkable part. He didn't shoot Suzuki, didn't drive him away, didn't treat him as an enemy. Instead, he made an offer. "I will only surrender if I receive a direct order from my commanding officer, Major Taniguchi." It was a way out, a compromise. Onoda couldn't simply walk away from his duty. That would make everything he'd done meaningless. But if he received a proper order, through the proper chain of command, relieving him of his duty, that would preserve the meaning of his sacrifice. That would allow him to return with his honor intact. Suzuki, to his credit, understood immediately. He wasn't dealing with a madman or a criminal. He was dealing with a soldier who needed permission to stop being a soldier. And if that's what it would take to end this 30-year vigil, Suzuki would make it happen.